Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Another 6.6 million Americans last week filed for unemployment, a record figure on top of 3.3 million that did the same the week before. So far, U.S. stimulus packages top $6 trillion. And the global figure stands at $54 trillion in economic action in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic that has killed thousands worldwide and infected hundreds of thousands more. And the situation is expected to get far worse before it gets better. With a bleak commercial outlook, the industry is adjusting as Airbus eyes production cuts. Boeing has already idled plants and has also closed a military line that includes its factory outside Philadelphia that produces Chinook helicopters and V-22 tilt-rotor fuselages that Bell finishes at its plant in Texas. Dividends are also being cut as eyes turn to what the next round of stimulus will look like. Joining us to discuss the week, as they do every week, are Dr. Rocket Ron Epstein of Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Sash Tusa of the independent equity research firm Agency Partners in London, and Richard Abalafia of the Teal Group Consultancy here in Washington, D.C. Guys, thanks very much for joining us.
Great to be here, Vago.
Thanks, Vago. Good to be here.
Always great to be on, Vago.
And before we get started, a quick shout out to all of our sponsors. Our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and broader cyber coverage. Fincantieri, Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. And Bell, of course, sponsors this podcast. Ron, start us off on sort of a macroeconomic level. You're not the chief economist of Bank of America, but want to get a little bit of the feedback that you're getting from investors. We've had extraordinary stimulus packages, record-setting by governments around the world, and yet markets continued to drop last week as more Americans than ever before in history filed for unemployment insurance. There's a sense that things are really snowballing in a way that is exceeding government's ability to respond. And there are those who are worried increasingly, not just about the US debt level, but the mounting debt level for states. What happens, God forbid, if the states start defaulting, and who covers that? God forbid what happens when average Americans can no longer pay their mortgages. You know, there's a lot made about everybody getting $1,200 from the government. $1,200 is nothing, when you have a mortgage to pay at the end of the day. And then, God forbid, interest rates go up, and then you really have a cascading nightmare scenario. What are you hearing from investors? And I want to kind of go around the horn on how folks should be thinking about where we are and what the potential implications are.
Yeah, maybe to broadly set the scene, this week, the Bank of America Global Economics team cut their outlook for global GDP this year to down minus 2.7%, almost 3%. Before that, they were just about flat. And if you look at what they're saying for Europe, they cut Europe from down 1.7% to down 7.5%, and the US down 6%. So, and that's just on the heels of cuts that they had made maybe just a week or two earlier, right? So one aspect of this that's impacted the financial community and governments and responses is how fast it happened. I mean, it's been fierce and ferocious, right? So that's impacted all kinds of things. Just Friday, I believe several of the major banks just started the small business lending programs that were part of the CARES Act, right? So I know from Bank of America's point of view, I can't speak for other banks, but I know, B of A did. They started doing that on Friday. I think they hired 10,000 call center folks, something like that, to help support that program. And that program's kind of off and running, right? So there's just always some sort of time lag between what the government does and how it gets into, the broader economy. From an investor point of view, I think a lot of conversations, particularly around commercial aerospace, have focused on valuation in that, one, many investors haven't been through a downturn. Two, those that haven't been through a downturn like this. So a lot of questions around valuation are really, how can I say, focused on how do you value things? Where is the bottom? How do we think about that? And that's why you're seeing such extreme volatility. Just using Boeing as a benchmark, right? It starts out at 300, goes down to 95, goes up to 180. back down to 120. I mean, it's all over the place. And a lot of that has to do with the market doesn't understand yet, or hasn't, how can I say, collectively congealed a valuation framework, because things like duration, impact, none of this has been seen before, right? So until the market figures that out, you probably, my guess would be, and to be clear, I'm not the strategist at Bank of America, far from it, just the aerospace guy, but at least in the aerospace community, and I think this probably is applicable to outside of my own sector, until the market can understand some of the things it's just too premature to understand, we won't see valuation and market stabilization. Even if you look at China, right? I mean, it really hasn't been hasn't been a V-shaped recovery there. It's been more U-shaped. And now there's talk in China that maybe there is some more cases coming up. So even in the countries that are farther along in the process than some other countries, it's still a nebulous process.
Nobody's ever seen anything like this, and it's not clear whether history books even have anything that's similar to this. Sash, talk to us from sort of a European perspective and where you see some of the big building blocks falling in place. And then Richard, would like to get your sense as well, because all three of you have an interesting ability at seeing things that maybe other people aren't seeing.
From where we are in Europe, we are combining the social impact of the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 2021 with the Great Recession, but we've managed to combine all of that into 2 months. So this is a catastrophic destruction of economic value, and it seems to me that at the moment the government responses to this pandemic, it reminds me of that sort of apocryphal saying from Vietnam: we had to destroy the village in order to save it. Governments are saying we have to destroy the economy in order to save it, or at least we have to destroy the economy in order to save the people in it. And particularly from the UK, there is absolutely no evidence at the moment that the government has got a vision of how to get out of the pandemic and the responses to the pandemic. So it's very, very serious indeed. I'm very interested because our conversations with investors very much echo those of Ron, and I think Ron absolutely put his finger on the key issues that investors are looking for. How do you value stocks in this? Where's the bottom? And so forth. We've actually done quite a lot of work on this over the years, and our view. I mean, we have a bit of a reputation as agency partners as being perma bears, but our view is it's going to get worse rather than a long time before it gets better. Although individual stocks will probably turn at different stages, but we think the key for stocks is actually the amount of debt they have to take on, whether straightforward debt, working capital, or leasing aircraft engines to customers because nobody else will deliver them that way. And our valuations for Boeing, Airbus, Safran, MTU are, particularly for the airframers, 40 to 50% lower than current share prices, because we've seen this occur in previous recessions. Stocks tend to trade on a very low EV to sales basis and then turn. Boy, when they turn, you make a lot of money, but it feels too early to us at the moment in that respect.
Richard?
I'm not sure. I completely agree with Sash on the whole destroy it to save it, because frankly, it's already pretty destroyed. I'm spending a lot of my time, as I'm sure we all are, reading what the great minds out there are thinking. And, the most resonant phrase I've heard, Paul Krugman in the Times said, the economy is in a medically induced coma right now. And I think that pretty well sums it up. What we've got in the jetliner industry is a luxury, if you could call it that, of a very high percentage of variable costs. As a matter of fact, as I'm constantly saying, Boeing and Airbus could just shut their factory gates and they'd be fine for a couple of years. 70% of the money goes to suppliers, you stop paying them. Another 10 or 15 or more goes to the workforce, you stop paying them. The economy takes another kick in the teeth, but the companies will be fine. Nothing of the same can be said for airlines, which they're far more capital intensive. They're far more fixed costs, or for that matter, restaurants. Restaurants have an enormous payroll. What is the end user market for restaurants right now? It's exactly zero. Vago, let's meet at our favorite neighborhood restaurant. It's closed.
My favorite neighborhood restaurant is your place, actually.
Well, that's very kind. We're open, but it's ill-advised for reasons of social distancing. But the message here is the economy is in a medically induced coma. It doesn't exist. Therefore, the trillions, that are being fed in are to keep its lifeblood going through this all. Now, the airlines, of course, they have no choice. You go straight to that $58 billion. The restaurants, the small businesses. I think another Times headline was that upfront couple trillion, that's just the start. I mean, it's a $20 trillion economy in the US that's in a medically induced coma. Now, the big question for our industry standpoint isn't about the end user market. Right now, that end user market is also, like every other market, perilously close to zero. The question is, will cash be sought and or provided to keep output going when the end user market has failed? That's the big question.
And so do we have any sense on how big that number is at this point, right? I mean, because I think that if you had asked people even a month ago whether or not we would get to 54 trillion, they would have probably not given you a number that big. And now there are people who are saying, okay, it could be $100 trillion, which is sort of unmodelable, right? I mean, this was a little bit like what US debt default looked like, right? It was an unmodelable scenario because it's something that folks never really considered. Does anybody have any sense on how much more will be enough given? I mean, look, I think people don't recognize the restaurant industry is $1 trillion part of the market, right?
Yeah, a much bigger
that
payroll.
Employs like what, 15 million people, and some staggering number of people, 14 million or whatever the number is, right? I mean, do we have any sense on what this package ends up topping at?
But all of these questions, especially that one, become an epidemiological question, as you know. I mean, we have a vaccine in 18 months, that'll plus another 6 months to distribute and do whatever else and take full effect. So that at least is when the pain and horror ends. But are there effective post-infection treatments that can make things better? Will the disease just build up, will people build up herd immunity to disease? Will there be some other way of burning it out in a matter of months? That would be tremendous, but I wouldn't bank on it. And probably the best case scenario is where something happens that makes it a little better, but not good enough to reliably fly places because there'll be repeated outbreaks, waves of travel bans, and whatever else. So really, whatever is needed to keep this medically induced coma patient going for about 2 years should be a reasonable base case assumption.
Wow. Sash, your hand is up.
Yeah, I just offer two thoughts, which very much mirror the comments that we're getting back from particularly pension fund clients here in Europe. Number one, it's never, ever been cheaper for governments to borrow, and it's only going to get cheaper. So, there's remarkably little worry about what we would regard as being nightmarish levels of government debt at the moment. And number two, when this finally gets sorted out, there will be inflation because there'll be too much cash sloshing around the system and not enough goods. And at that stage, a ton of the debt gets inflated away. We have not had pushback from investors worrying about the government debt particularly. Governments ultimately can always go back and tax people. That's why governments tend to be higher rated than corporates. The key is to try to take the economies out of what I think Richard beautifully described as these medically induced comas.
Let's go to the micro level, and Ron, why don't you start us off on Boeing, Airbus, the commercial supply chain, and now what appears to be a defense ramification, right? I mean, Boeing's decision to close effectively one of the nation's most important helicopter factories has knock-on effects as well, given that Bell is the one who finishes those fuselages into V-22s and delivers them from its facility in Amarillo.
Yeah, so
and that's just one example, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think when you think about commercial versus defense, commercial a real-time gauge we look at, what's going on. We've been tracking passenger movements through the TSA in the US and through security in Europe. You can do that, right? Real time. And what you've seen in both regions is it's down about 95%. Like, numbers that are just mind-numbing, right? So in the US, just because it's on top of head, this past week, about a year ago, each day, we had about 2.3 million people going through the TSA. And this week it was about 150,000 per day, right? And that's who's flying, right? So you have an end market that's down 95% right now, and all the ramifications of that, what it means for the airlines, what it means for everybody. So the end market in commercial is hurting really bad. If you think about, the transfer function of air traffic to end market of aftermarket, it's something like for every percent of air traffic droppage, you get 1.5% to 2% of, air traffic drop. You get 1.5% to 2% of aftermarket drop. Right? I mean, you're going to have just mind-numbingly huge falls in the aftermarket. So a real end market issue. In defense, it's a little different, right? I mean, I don't think anybody at this point is worried about defense spending. Could there be disruption? So you look at what's going on in Philadelphia with Boeing. Who knows? Could happen at other plants, other parts of the world. But just assume for a second. Let's just look at Boeing Philadelphia as a case in isolation. It's not like the government doesn't want those things. It's not like that end market went away. There's just a disruption when they're going to get delivered. So the big difference for me anyway between defense and commercial is the defense end market is fine. You could have work disruptions, which not that that's good, but relative to your end market going from 100 to 5, it's great, right? And in fact, it's part of a broader stimulus package. It's hard to envision defense getting cut, right? F-35 gets spent in 50 states. It's just a really nice way to sprinkle money everywhere. So it's hard to imagine that defense would actually get cut. And then one last thought on the debt question, because that comes up a little bit about what's that mean for defense. We print our debt in our currency, and so far we're still the world's reserve currency. And it's all relative, who's the best neighborhood. Even if the whole world right now is a bad neighborhood, who's the best neighborhood? And that's what you're seeing going on with US interest rates, so on and so forth. You've seen treasuries in terms of price rally, yields fall, because folks are, a flight for safety into US treasuries.
For the time being, right? I mean, that's the big fear that folks have about how necessarily all of that might shake out. Although anybody who listened to our Thursday podcast heard a lot of some leading budget minds in Washington, D.C. say that they're really, really concerned about what that defense budget outlook looks like, especially as you look out a year when the government is going to have to make ends meet. I completely agree with you. F-35 is a great thing to spend money on, assuming you have money to spend. The minute you don't have money to spend is when it becomes a little more problematic. Sash, take us on your sense on Boeing, but as well on what Airbus is telegraphing about where its production rates are likely to go and what that in turn means.
I'll focus on Airbus because I think Ron and Richard are just a ton closer to Boeing at the moment. But Airbus this week has clearly been starting to telegraph that it's looking at some huge production cuts. I mean, we wrote quite a big note about this a couple of weeks ago. And the issues for Airbus, apart from that, there is just no demand. I mean, look at the Air New Zealand CEO's letter this week, where he says, at the end of all of this, Air New Zealand is going to be an airline that is 30% smaller than it is today. Not 30% smaller than it was planned to be in 5 years' time, but 30% smaller than it is today. I thought that was one of the most frank, honest letters to stakeholders that's been written by an airline yet. That suggests to us there's precious little demand for new aircraft at the moment. And Airbus is apparently looking at production cuts of about 50%, 50%. A320 coming down from 63 a month to about 30. The A350 coming down from 10 to 5, plus or minus. But these are enormous cuts, and this reflects partly the fact that they just can't get the production back to previous levels, because if everybody is 2 meters apart or more than 2 meters apart, you can never build an aircraft as fast as when everybody is crammed into a fuselage or a wing box, putting in the plumbing and the wiring and everything else. But it's also a reflection of the fact there's just no demand, so what's the point in trying? And I think that's a really, that's really worrying, because that will cascade down the whole supply chain. Our forecasts are that Airbus will not return to its 2019 level of deliveries, 860, within any reasonable forecast horizon. Mid-20s, late 20s, just not going to get there again. So, the industry has been permanently damaged by this. I'd just make one comment then, I think, about defense spending. I mean, there is an issue, which is that, defense spending just feels like something less important to a European economy than health spending at the moment. I think the issue is that one of the, policymakers are starting, but only starting to be aware, certainly in Europe and probably the US as well, that at the end of all of this, whatever the end looks like, the two adversaries that drive our defense spending in Europe and the US, Russia for Europe, China for the US, are going to be a whole lot stronger relative to us than they were when we went in. Now, I think that the pattern of defense spending is going to change. I think that there is an awareness in some countries that they have been over-reliant on other countries. They've been over-reliant on fragile supply chains and so forth. So it may well be that more money is spent at home. But I'm not convinced that defense spending is actually going to change a whole lot. Because I think, if you're European, Russia is going to look a whole lot more frightening a year, 2 years down the line than it did a year back. And as for China, China is going to come out of this massively stronger in a geopolitical sense. And that's the big challenge for the US. So I'm a bull of defense, but I think it's going to be very, very tough for a while. And I'll just give one example, if I may, very quickly, of the sort of the change in the defense politics here in Europe. If you look at the Twitter accounts of the major, of the defense ministries, the health ministries, and so forth in Europe, one of the things that stands out is the unbelievable scale of Franco-Swiss cooperation at the moment. The French are flying Swiss patients out of Switzerland in French army NH-90 helicopters to treat them in France. There are trains going across the border with patients from each country. And you know what? I'm prepared to bet that Rafale is a shoe-in for the Swiss fighter contract, because the Franco-Swiss relationship has just got stronger as a result of this horrible pandemic. And where's the US in Europe? It's nowhere.
And now a word from our sponsor. The Defense and Aerospace Report is brought to you by the Bell V-280 Valor, bringing the mission technology of the future to the battlefield of today. Visit bellflight.com for more. Why do you say that you think China is going to come out of this stronger? Because there are those who look at China, for example, and say its supply lines are very vulnerable, given that there are people who are going to transfer capability out. There are those who say that the coronavirus impact was worse and was underreported, and that the country has a whole series of other challenges that it's facing.
I think a lot of that's wishful thinking. Ultimately, I think that the Chinese move towards a greater global position as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative is not just intact but strengthened. The Chinese are shipping masks, they're shipping ventilators, as are the Russians, and we talked about this last week. The Russians shipping ventilators and indeed entire military units to Italy. You're not seeing the reciprocal happening. Nobody's delivering stuff to China. The Chinese-Russian influence across the world has got stronger as a result of this. The macro issues, are they lying on their stats? I neither know nor care, frankly. What I know is more people think the Chinese are there to help them as a result, even than last week, let alone a month ago. Wrong,
Richard?
But that's, that's sort of ground truth.
Richard?
I think the Chinese government is what it is. The only way you have soft power in the world is by having a good government with good intentions. I don't believe that's the case right now. I understand why an American administration that has as its calling card Make America Great Again, or even worse, America First, without any reference to the disgusting political history of that phrase. I understand why that administration would not have much soft power, but normally we do. Even when we were invading Iraq, it was still a fairly internationalist crowd. They were interested in engaging the world. I didn't necessarily agree with that method of engaging, but they did engage with the world, and we were good at it. We've always had soft power as a result. The Chinese Communist Party, no, this does not go well. Everything about this looks horribly mishandled, and I just don't see how they wind up in a place with more power as a consequence of this. And if you're also looking for a place with a massive debt load problem, oh, there'd be a good place to look.
Yeah, but if I may add one thing, and Ron, I want to bring you in here in a second as well. They weren't the friend that wasn't there. And at the end of the day, we now have leader after leader, and I want to ask everybody this question, leader after leader, whether they're Canadian, they're German, they're French, they're Italian, are raising concerns that you guys are now bidding against us. You're bidding against us for ventilators. You're bidding against us for gloves. And we don't have a sense that you guys are actually an ally and a friend, that we're in this with you together. And at the end of the day, that has implications. In fact, to make things worse, we're the pain in the butt friend, right? I mean, Mike Pompeo was admonishing Italians on their worst day ever in terms of death toll, saying, you guys aren't being forthcoming enough with data that we need to protect Americans. And I'm sure there were people in Italy who looked at that and said, what the hell is wrong with you guys? You know, I mean, what are the implications of this? Because Italy just introduced also a new industrial strategy. I think, Sash, that's what you were alluding to. Ron, let me bring you in. How does this dynamic where the United States maybe is not as popular as it should be, what are the potential implications for that, whether it's for defense programs or for anything else, as you look further down the road?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, this is a little bit above my pay grade, but if I look at it specifically through the lens of, you know, my little world of aerospace and defense, right? I mean, it would make a logical conclusion that selling, you know, U.S. kit, be it commercial or defense, in other parts of the world, difficult. However, I would maybe just caution, we're in this, in some ways, at least to our generations, right? You know, multiple generations. We haven't seen something like this since what, 1918? So there, it feels like there's a little bit of every man for himself-ism going on here across the international community. I'm not saying what the U.S. has done is right or wrong. Not my position to go there. Right. However, you know, be it as it may, and countries will have their perceptions. Could that have impacts on future sales of, you know, commercial products or defense products? Sure, it could. But I think it's too soon to tell, right? Because we're in the, you know, kind of in the apex of the tornado, whatever you want to call it.
Right. Eye of the storm. Eye of the storm.
Yeah, eye of the storm, right? We'll see later, right? Ultimately, right? So,
if I could just add to that, you know, it seems that the problem here is not this, you know, specific to any set of bilateral relations, but rather just that every man for himself thing that Ron just spoke of. This is bad from a multinational weapons cooperation and industrial development standpoint. I mean, yes, the Italians are mad at us. I bet they're even madder at the Germans, who did exactly nothing to help and indeed were rather counterproductive during Italy's worst moments. So is that conducive to the sort of cross-border collaboration we've seen in Europe? Does anybody feel particularly inspired right now? I mean, by European actions, the Germans appear to be willing to tolerate the arrival of a fascist dictatorship in the middle of NATO and the EU. Oh, that's not good at all. You know, frankly, I've never taken the whole Brexit thing seriously, but I'm starting to understand, even just so vaguely, the spirit behind it, because frankly, at least they were ahead of this horrible, noxious curve.
So let me add one thing.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, just in this, I think begs an important question for commercial aero, defense for sure, but commercial aero. We're and this is a conversation we could have for hours in another venue, but where does this take this down the path of globalization, right? I mean, if we've seen the peak of that, was this thought towards increased globalization a luxury? Maybe, I don't know, right? But I mean, when you start looking at the light at the end of the tunnel, what's the world going to be like after this? There's going to have to be large questions around global supply chains, who you're working with, how they're distributed, even beyond the question of politics, who's a friend, who's an enemy, but just lessons learned around not having too much exposure in one place, having enough of what you need at home, and then on top of that, who was your friend, who was your enemy, how tense is everything after we get out of this? It's hard to imagine a world where you're kind of back to, kind of on the highfalutin political level, open borders and all that. I mean, that just seems like a very long time ago, and maybe in some ways very luxurious thinking.
Sash?
Yeah, look, I agree with Ron on that. I slightly take issue with Richard on European internal politics, which are extremely difficult, and I mean there are clearly massive stresses within the European Union at the moment, particularly over Hungary. I wouldn't underestimate those. The European Union as an institution isn't coming out of this particularly well at the moment. It generally sorts itself out about one crisis in arrears, but I think as a broader issue, a friend in need is a friend indeed, and the US has not been seen to be acting, to help anybody else or in collaboration with anybody else in this crisis, and that I fear will be remembered.
Do you think, Sash, I mean, especially in the wake of Italy's industrial policy, which you did allude to, as I mentioned a moment ago, what are the deglobalization tendencies, right? I mean, Richard has been talking about this for some time, that we may be in a period of true deglobalization that will carry with it its own implications. And if you look at it as people extract supply chains from China, that is another concern, right? That people will move supply and production out of China to their own countries. At the end of the day, how do you see this all evolving?
I think that the trends to I think globalization is going to reverse across our industry. I think that extended supply lines are recognized as being vulnerable. I was speaking to a Northern European manufacturer of combat aircraft this week, and they said very, very proudly, vast majority of the components for our combat aircraft are produced in this country. And therefore we can keep on delivering this combat aircraft to our export customers. And that, I think, is that's a lesson that's being seen across a wide variety of companies at the moment.
Is there anything we need to quickly discuss in the sort of 5 minutes we've got left?
I've just got one point that I'd like to highlight, which is very much a stock market issue, which is the degree to which even companies that are economically defensive, defense companies, are under pressure from stakeholders, particularly governments, but by no means entirely, to stop paying dividends. And we had three defense companies in Europe this week, Kinetic in the UK, BAE Systems in the UK, and Saab, each withdrew their dividend proposal at the very end, the very cusp of having their annual general meeting. Not because they can't afford to pay, not because their end markets are affected, but because it was seen as politic, with a small p, not to pay a dividend at a time when governments are trying to support industry and when there's a, sort of a bigger issue involved. That's clearly very bad if you're an investor who relies on income. But it's a feature of the fact that I think even paradoxically the defense sector is moving towards the we're all in it together environment.
Ron and Richard, your take on that, and any other parting thoughts for the week?
Yeah, I mean, because of what's going on the commercial aerospace side of A&D, my sense is there's also, and I like the way Sash phrased it, politic with a small p, about being anti-dividend, although we haven't seen any movements like that from the defense companies. One thing I might note, an important market event that happened this week was the Raytheon Technologies event happened, right? So United Technologies is gone, Raytheon's gone, and now we have Raytheon Technologies, which started trading as Raytheon Technologies on Friday. Why do I take this moment to bring it up? One of the questions was, how about their dividend, right? Because of the United Technologies heritage piece, they have a big piece of commercial aerospace exposure, big aftermarket exposure, as we discussed before, which will be down a lot. Are they still going to have a dividend? In commentary from their CEO late in the week, he said their dividend will be strong. He didn't put any numbers around that, just basically implying they'll still have a dividend, where the likes of Boeing and other companies have cut their dividend. Raytheon Technologies is still planning to have one. It's also hard for me to imagine that Lockheed or Northrop would be cutting their dividend either, or whatever. I mean, I don't think it's a very small P in politics here, but I do think it is a factor that is permeating around the market for sure.
Richard?
Yeah, it's a fascinating aspect of the industrial landscape these days, but of course, so much of it is for optics, I mean, when you've got the entire economy in stasis and everyone's looking for government aid, then having given away a high percentage of, your operating cash flow to shareholders is going to be seen as a liability in the optics front. But I think it's important to know that this is such a unique moment in economic times. I think we'd all agree. And, Boeing, in terms of shareholder returns for the past decade, not really what you call great from the optics standpoint, given having, I think, peaked out at like 99% of cash flow given back in dividends and buybacks. Airbus, by contrast, far better at funding R&D, far less aggressive about giving cash away, and yet both find themselves in exactly the same place and affected by this crisis in exactly the same way, and both wrestling with the conundrum of having to keep factories open, and really nothing about that shareholder return policy for the past 10 years would alter the outcome of where we are at this very strange moment in time. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that this is more about optics than anything substantive.
Guys, very quickly, to get your take on the deal between Boeing as well as the U.S. Air Force. How do you guys see that?
I think there's an awareness that having any kind of overhang of risk of any sort right now is just not good. And even better, accelerated payments are probably a good thing. So getting the $880 million or what it is just out the door, and Boeing disagrees to do the work, replace the camera, do whatever else needs to be done, that's great. A positive step forward. But of course, the picture continues to emerge that this is KC-46 is just the mother of all problem children. Hopefully, this will be the last major concern, but I doubt it, looking at history.
Ron?
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective, being mediocre didn't stop you from getting paid, right, at a particular time when you need to get paid. So is it a form of the U.S. government helping them out when they need it? Yeah, probably. They're going to have to develop a new system, right? So ultimately, in the end, what they're getting paid, are they going to spend more than that on developing a new camera system, fixing the fuel leaks, so on and so forth? Yeah, but it's still honestly mind-numbing that you could take an aircraft like the 767, admittedly probably not well suited to be a tanker for any number of reasons that we could go into offline, but screw it up like they have. I mean, it's really mind-numbing. But anyway, it is what it is. It's history at this point, and there you have it.
But it's what you do if you want to maximize headcount for political leverage at reduced cost, because of course the people you're losing are the most expensive.
All right, guys. Thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Look forward to having you back on next week.
Thanks, Vago.
Yeah, thanks, Vago. Great to be here.
Always a fun afternoon. Thank you, Vago.
Thank you. And thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DefAero Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. And check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman, and our technology report sponsored by General Motors Defense. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.